No fancy intro this time, let's get straight to the point. Navia is a 5-star attack scaling Geo hyper carry with a playstyle focused around doing a lot of single instance damage from her elemental skill, while also getting in some damage and Geo application from her normal attacks and burst. Per usual with these TC analysis videos, this video is not meant to be a full Navia guide where I go into detail breaking down her kit, as I am assuming most of you already mostly understand what she does. Instead, I am here to break down the math and give my analysis on what works best with her and how good I think she is. So let's jump right into the math. Starting with the most exciting thing, we have Navia's teams. With Navia, you want to have 2 units that are Pyro, Hydro, or Cryo, as Navia gains 20% attack per PHC character on the party, up to 40%. Since Navia is an attack scaler, Bennett is an absolute must-have to maximize Navia's damage. For the second buffer, Furina is by far the best option. She provides an excellent buff while also doing excellent sub-DPS damage at the same time. And contrary to popular belief, Bennett is plenty enough healing for a Furina team. And as we know, Navia is a Geo hyper carry that relies on getting crystallized shards for her elemental skill to do a lot of damage. Naturally, this means she really wants to have a second Geo unit on her team. Geo Resonance will provide a massive buff to her damage through the Res Shred and damage bonus, and make your shields a lot stronger, which can be important if you are relying on Crystallize as your only means of shielding. Having a second Geo unit will also help reduce Navia's energy requirements by a lot. Let's take a look at the math for the team core of Navia, Furina, Bennett, with different Geo unit options as the last slot. First, we have Albedo. Albedo comes out as the highest DPS option for a few reasons. Firstly, he does really good sub-DPS damage here, since he is getting buffed by all 3 of Geo Resonance, Furina, and Bennett. His skill scales with attack, but we use his burst in this rotation, and these buffs allow it to actually do some okay damage. Secondly, out of all the possible Geo options, he has the most reliable off-field Geo damage. This allows him to proc Crystallize from off-field to have Navia stack her skill, and it allows him to make Geo Particles from off-field so that they are easily cart by Navia to minimize her energy requirements. Secondly, I have Zhongli. Zhongli, being one of the best options, should be no surprise. He provides a really strong shield, Tenacity of the Millilith, and his Resistance Shred. I have seen some suggestions that Zhongli can be used as sub-DPS with his burst here since Navia has flexible rotations, but I did the math for him being built for damage and using his burst, and it was pretty much always a DPS loss over either using Navia on field for those 2 seconds instead, or just ending the rotation 2 seconds earlier. It could be nice in practice if you need Petrify for crowd control though. Now, while Zhongli sheets a bit below Albedo, in practice, you might find that he is better. Navia's personal damage is about 11% higher with Zhongli than Albedo, so depending on how well you invested your Navia is compared to your Albedo, the increase in her personal damage might be able to outscale Albedo's sub-DPS damage. The team will also be a lot more convenient to build with Zhongli than Albedo, since you don't need to worry about having good artifacts on Zhongli, while you do want a solid set on Albedo for his damage. The third highest DPS Geo option I have is, surprisingly, Geo Traveler, actually pretty close behind Zhongli and Albedo. Geo Traveler does okay personal damage here. It's not a lot, but it's enough to be noticeable. In my calcs, I have Traveler on Favonia's Sword to help with team energy, but if you find you don't need that and can use something more offensive like Jade Cutter, Wolffang, or Finale of the Deep, then Traveler would actually be doing some legit sub-DPS damage. But on top of their damage being surprisingly okay, Traveler also provides a 10% crit rate buff that has 100% uptime. 10% doesn't sound like a lot, but based on my math, on average it should increase Navia's damage by about 7%. Traveler also provides an interruption resistance buff that you get full uptime on. It isn't needed since we have plenty of crystallized shards for that already, but it can be nice if you happen to get hit before picking up a shard. Overall, Traveler is a really good pick if you don't have access to Zhongli or Albedo. Just keep in mind that Traveler's skill can be very clunky and annoying to use. Now the next option below Geo Traveler that I have is Ningguang. With Ningguang, I have her doing her C6 quick swap combo of EQ ECA. This takes a lot of field time, so the team is sort of more like a dual carry team between Navia and Ningguang if you use her. Ningguang does do a lot of damage if you do this, but because of the amount of time it takes, you have to cut out Navia's second in for attack chain from the rotation, as all the buffs will be expired by then. If you have a highly invested Ningguang with really good artifacts and a 5-star weapon, this can reflect better in comparison to the other options than what the sheets reflect, but at the same time, Navia does a lot less personal damage here since you cut her field time short than she does in the other teams, so if you have a well-built Navia, making the field time for Ningguang shouldn't be worth it over the other options. Ningguang, however, does make a good 4-star option if you don't have access to albedo and zhongli, but it's kinda hard to recommend her when everybody has a C6 Geo Traveler, and in my opinion, Traveler is the better option overall. And the last Geo option I calculated is Yunjin, because I love Yunjin. Navia does perform normal attacks, but it's only 12 total hits, and that's nowhere near enough to make Yunjin's buff worthwhile, so just don't use her. So to quickly summarize, use either albedo or zhongli. If you don't have either of them, use either Geo Traveler or Ningguang, with Geo Traveler being the option I recommend most. Now you might also be wondering, in this team of Navia, albedo, furina, Bennett, can Bennett or furina be replaced if you don't have them available? With Bennett, I would not advise trying to replace him at all. His buffing is just way too big for someone that scales with attack as much as Navia. As for furina, she is the best option for her slot by a good margin, but here's the math for a few other options. Fischl does good damage since she'll be buffed by Bennett. She only takes about 1 second of field time, so you can perform about an 18-second rotation with her. Yelan is Yelan. Here she is essentially an inferior furina, doing good damage and providing good buffing, but both her damage and buffing are lower than furina's. But a dollar store furina is still a great product. And the last option I considered for this slot is Zhongling. I expected Zhongling to be a lot higher than this, since you get Pyro Resonance with her and she does the most damage out of all the other options. But Zhongling needs a lot of energy, so you have to perform a longer rotation to funnel particles from Bennett to her, which brings the DPS down quite noticeably compared to other options. Alright, now that covers Navia's teams as a main DPS, but you might have also heard that she can work well as a sub DPS, since most of her damage comes from her skill, so you don't actually need to keep her on field to do a lot of damage. Navia does still take a lot of field time to do this though, so that really limits the amount of teams she can work as a sub DPS in. So there's only a few teams where I found that this might work well. The first team is Navia, lyney, zhongli, Bennett. Lyney's field time is low and flexible enough for Navia to be able to get off 2 skill casts, and her and lyney still both get Bennett's buff on all of their damage, excluding Navia's burst. Lyney's personal damage does suffer just a bit here though. Since this team doesn't have 3 pyro units, he's going to lose a bit of buffing from his weapon and his passive. Compared to Navia's main DPS teams, this is pretty comparable in DPS. However, since lyney is the main DPS here, we need to also compare it to his other team options. And compared to lyney's highest damaging teams like lyney, Bennett, Zhongling, and furina, Kazuha, or Venti as the 4th slot, Navia is a lot less DPS. But the big thing with lyney Navia team is that it's a shielded team, so it's going to be a lot more comfortable and more practical to play. And if we compare this team to lyney's other team setups with a shield, this is actually a lot stronger than those alternatives. The next sub-DPS team I considered for Navia was Noelle, furina, Navia, and Jean. Here, Navia's value isn't just doing good sub-DPS damage, but she can also help provide some interruption resistance with Crystallize, which is very nice if you don't have Noelle at C1. She also buffs both Noelle and furina with Archaic Petra, and since Navia pulls crystals to her, you don't need to manually pick them up for this. And her damage is still decent enough here, despite being solo Geo and not having Bennett buff, since she is buffed by furina still. Overall, this is pretty similar in strength to Novelle's other team options, but it doesn't really have any advantages over using one of his other team options. Still, she is a new and competent option for him, and having more options is always a good thing. And lastly, out of curiosity, I calculated using Navia as a sub DPS for Noelle, with a team of Noelle, Navia, Furina, Bennett. And this one is just not worth it. You scuff both Noelle and Navia's damage by trying to use them together, and you would get a stronger team for either of them by just simply not pairing the two of them together. So overall, Navia does have good sub DPS potential. I wouldn't recommend pulling her with the intent of using her as a sub DPS, but her potential to work well as a sub DPS can give her more potential account value, since it's something you may be able to do with her if you ever get bored of using her as a hyper carry. Now let's take a look at Navia's weapons. Her signature is her best weapon, with an R5 Serpent Spine being about equal. Beacon, R1 Spine, Red Horn, and Unforged are your next best options. For non-BP 4-star options, your best bet is going to be Tidal's Shadow if you can reliably heal for it, or the event Melusine Claymore. Keep in mind that if you are using Navia as a sub DPS and not a hyper carry, she will need more energy recharge, so her ER weapons will gain some value. For Navia's artifacts, there are only 3 sets I consider worth calculating on her. And those artifacts are Meirashusei Hunter, the new Geo set Whisper, and Golden Troop. Whisper is naturally her best set, but if you don't want to farm it and are using Furina, the Hunter set is only about 5% behind. Golden Troop, I wouldn't recommend using it as it's 11% behind Whisper, since using Navia on field will mean you only get 50% skill damage from it. But if you're using Navia as a sub DPS, Golden Troop will be a lot closer since you will get the full 70% skill damage. Now Keg Patra also becomes an option and will usually be the best option for team DPS if you're using Navia as a sub DPS. And for main stats, you want attack, geo, crit. And for substats, you focus on crit damage, crit rate, and attack percent, and get energy recharge up to like 120 to 130%, and that should be enough for all of our teams as a main DPS. The last piece of math to look at is Navia's constellations. Her C1 barely increases her damage. She already needs very little ER, so the energy refund doesn't do much, although if using Navia as a sub DPS, this can be nice to have. The cooldown reduction on her burst is kinda useless though. C2 is pretty good, giving a lot of skill crit rate and a bit more hits of her burst. For modern day C2 standards, it isn't great, but it's decent. C3 is a pretty similar increase to her C2, since it increases her skill talent level, and that's where most of her damage comes from. Her C4 is actually pretty good for C4 standards. 20% Geo Shred is a straightforward 9 to 10% damage increase, and that will increase your albedo's damage as well if you're using him, so that's pretty nice. C5 doesn't do much, as her burst is the lowest portion of her damage. And C6, the percentile increase doesn't look like that much for a 5-star C6, but her skill is going to be easily doing like 400,000 to 500,000 damage at C6, and she can do that up to 3 times in a rotation. So she's basically going to be front-loading damage equivalent to Eula's burst damage, which is absolutely insane when you realize you can do it multiple times in the same rotation. Overall, Navia's constellations are by no means bad, but unless you are going for C6, I personally don't think they provide enough value to recommend going for them. If you want to vertically invest into Navia, get Furina C1 to C2, get her either an R5 Serpent Spine or her weapon. So now, let's debrief. Navia does a lot of personal damage, and the DPS of her strongest teams is very solid. It's clearly not as high as DPS monsters like Lyney, Wanderer, Noelle, etc., but it's still very good. Also, something with Navia that isn't reflected in my calcs is that she can use her skill 3 times in her first rotation, which can allow her to extend her field time to do considerably more damage with 1 more skill and Infor. This, into a flexible field time, can give her very good rotational flexibility to reach thresholds to run rotate bosses, and to adapt to different combat scenarios. Rotational flexibility allows characters to sometimes represent their sheet performance in practice more realistically than less flexible characters. Navia's damage is mostly single target, but she is by no means strictly single target. She has pretty decent AoE on her burst and normal attacks, and her skill is capable of hitting more than 1 enemy. Her AoE is far from the greatest, but it is by no means non-existent. One other problem you may find with her in AoE though, is she is a melee DPS playing Circle Impact with Bennett while not having any grouping. One last thing you may be wondering about Navia is, how does she compare to other Geo main DPS units, aka Itto and Noelle? Navia does very similar personal damage to Itto, but her damage and DPS is notably high. Her team damage and team DPS is notably higher, since she has both furina and albedo for good sub-DPS damage, while Itto only has albedo. However, Itto has a much better AoE than Navia, so in my opinion, Navia is a much better single target DPS than Itto, while Itto is a better AoE DPS. Noelle's personal damage and team DPS is a lot lower than Navia's, but like Itto, Noelle has better AoE. I think you can definitely claim that Navia is the best Geo DPS in the game, but it's not as if she's just straight up better than Itto. She has advantages over him, and he has advantages over her. So, to conclude, here is how I would rank Navia on my 5-star tier list. DPS/support is a 9, single target is a 10, AoE is a 7, multi-wave a 7, vertical a 7, shield break a 6, accessibility flexibility an 8, and the overall score is 54, which puts her very comfortably into A tier. If you like Navia and are still considering if you should pull for her or not, I say go for it. She's a very solid and well-balanced DPS, and I think she will meet your expectations. That's all. If you liked today's video, please be sure to give it a like and subscribe and leave a comment down below. Thanks. Bye.